In November of 1928, a French luxury liner steamed east across the Atlantic with 3 passengers seated at the same dinner table. One of them, Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr., already commanded one of the largest private fortunes in America. Beside him sat his wife of 14 years, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, mother of 7 children and daughter of a former mayor of Boston, a woman who attended Mass every morning of her adult life. Across from them sat a woman whose face sold more magazines than most politicians, Gloria Swanson, one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood, and Joseph's mistress. For 6 days, Rose smiled at her, dined with her, asked politely after her health, and mentioned nothing. Not a raised eyebrow, not a tremor in the voice, not a single passenger aboard that ship recorded even a crack in her composure. Rose knew. Most biographers of the family concluded that she knew, though not one of them ever located a letter, a diary page, or a remark to a friend in which she admitted it. She would lose a son to an exploding bomber, a daughter to a plane crash, 2 more sons to assassins, and a 4th child to a surgeon's incision. Yet the single wound she never once discussed with anyone belonged to the man sitting beside her at that table. Why would a woman endure such humiliation and then keep enduring it for 4 more decades? What does 60 years of chosen silence cost the person who keeps it? Join me to find out. Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald arrived on the 22nd of July 1890 into a city that had already decided what she was allowed to become. Irish Catholics filled the wards and the parish halls of Boston, while the Protestant families of Beacon Hill kept the drawing rooms, the clubs, the banks, and the colleges entirely for themselves. 2 worlds, 1 city, and a wall between them that neither prayers nor ambition could dissolve, only money, and only if you were a man. Her father, John Francis Fitzgerald, had climbed the democratic machinery of the North End until the voters elected him mayor in 1906. The nickname he collected along the way, Hunafitz, explained his method precisely. He sang at weddings, wept at funerals, remembered 10,000 names, and never once forgot a grudge. Rose grew up as her father's most polished instrument. She stood beside him on platforms and poured tea for ward captains and understood early that her value was decorative, political, and contingent on male approval. She later recalled her quiet hope of attending Wellesley College, a hope that collapsed the moment her father and a cardinal made a different decision in a room she was not invited to enter. Her father decided. Rose obeyed. That pattern would repeat itself across the next 8 decades with different men and identical results. They met in the summer of 1906 at Old Orchard Beach in Maine, where both families took their holidays. Rose turned 16 that summer. Joseph Patrick Kennedy, born in September of 1888, reached 18 a few weeks later, and he already carried the compressed ambition of a boy whose father owned saloons and delivered votes. Nothing about a seaside introduction between 2 teenagers announced a dynasty. But Honey Fitz understood precisely whose son stood in front of his daughter. Patrick Joseph Kennedy, known across East Boston as PJ, ran a ward organization that competed directly with the Fitzgerald machine on the other side of the harbor. The 2 men shared a religion, a party, a city, and a hunger for the same offices, and Boston politics of that era converted such overlap into open war. Honey Fitz opposed the courtship for 8 years. He opposed it loudly, and he opposed it with the full administrative power of a mayor who could relocate his daughter to another continent whenever young Joseph Kennedy drew too close. In 1908, Rose enrolled at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York, a placement her father arranged with the affection of a man building a fence. 2 years later, she crossed the ocean to a convent school at Blumenthal in Prussia, and afterward to another in Paris. German came first, then French, then the particular Catholicism of the pre-Vatican Roman II convent with its rigid schedules and its iron teaching that a woman who suffers quietly purchases currency in the next world. Boston lay 4,000 miles behind her, and Joseph Kennedy wrote to her anyway. Letter after letter across the ocean her father paid for. The distance changed nothing. Boston folklore preserves a line from Honey Fitz about young Joe Kennedy, a sentence involving worst enemies in marriage, repeated across 100 retellings and never once recorded at the time by anyone in the room. Historians now treat the phrase as embellishment rather than transcript, though the sentiment matches everything else on the record. Honey Fitz wanted a different husband for his daughter. He spent the better part of a decade proving it through geography, tuition payments, chaperones, and the careful scheduling of European tours that kept an ocean between his daughter and East Boston. Joseph waited. And while he waited, he climbed. At 25, he took control of the Columbia Trust Company in East Boston, a bank his own father helped to found, and the newspapers described him as the youngest bank president in America. The claim flattered him and probably overstated the truth. Either way, Joseph Kennedy now ran a bank, and a mayor who dealt in influence understood the arithmetic of that perfectly well. The strategy failed. On the 7th of October 1914, Rose Fitzgerald married Joseph Kennedy in the private chapel of Cardinal O'Connell, the same man who 6 years earlier had steered her toward the convent. Rose turned 24 that July. Joseph turned 26 a month before the ceremony. No cathedral crowds. No press stampede. Nothing a mayor's daughter of that era might reasonably expect. The ceremony passed in front of a small gathering, quickly and without spectacle. The couple moved into a modest house at 83 Beales Street in Brookline. 9 children would follow. Rose crossed that threshold carrying the conviction drilled into her at Blumenthal and Paris, that a wife absorbs whatever a wife receives, without complaint, without question, and without end. Whether Joseph crossed it with any conviction at all remains a question his biographers still argue over. He wanted sons, capital, political access, and a surname the Brahmins could not refuse. And Rose delivered the first of those 4 requirements with a speed that consumed her 20s entirely. Joseph Kennedy pursued money with the concentration other men reserved for religion. He rose through Boston banking, moved into shipbuilding during the war, and then into the stock market, where the loose rules of the 1920s allowed a clever operator to manufacture fortunes out of other people's optimism. Work kept him away from Brookline for weeks at a stretch. Rose, alone in the house with the children, learned the shape of a marriage conducted largely by telegram. The children came without pause. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. in July of 1915. John Fitzgerald Kennedy in May of 1917. Rosemary in September of 1918, during the influenza pandemic, and several biographers report that a delayed delivery starved the infant of oxygen for a span of minutes that would define, and eventually devastate, the rest of her life. Kathleen, whom the family called Kick, arrived in February of 1920, 4 children in 5 years, and Rose turned 30 only that summer in a house she seldom left and a marriage she was only beginning to understand. Joseph missed most of it. Through the war, he ran a shipyard at Fore River, sleeping at the plant for weeks. In the autumn of 1918, the influenza swept through Boston while Rose delivered their 3rd child with the doctor delayed elsewhere. Rose recovered. The nation counted its dead. The schools closed. The churches emptied. The theaters shuttered. And a young mother in Brookline nursed an infant nobody yet recognized as permanently damaged. The church forbade contraception. Her husband wanted heirs. Her father would tolerate no complaint from a married woman. Boston in 1920 supplied no vocabulary for what she felt. Convent training supplied the rest. Exhaustion, she had been taught, belonged to the ordinary condition of a Catholic wife rather than to any injustice worth naming. Rose did not complain. Not where anyone could hear her. No letter, no diary page, no confessor, no friend ever recorded a single word of protest against the life her husband had arranged around her like a cage with comfortable furniture. Then, late in 1920, something finally broke open. Rose Kennedy left her husband. She carried a 5th child at the time, a daughter who would arrive the following July under the name Eunice, and she carried something heavier still, the full weight of a life in which nobody had ever once asked what she wanted, what she needed, or what she feared. Not her father. Not her husband. Not her church. Not one person in 30 years had put that question to her and waited for the answer. The older children traveled with her. Her destination lay 3 miles away at her parents' house in Dorchester. 3 miles. That was all. And she intended, by every account the family preserved, to end the marriage for good. Her father refused to take her in. No transcript of that conversation exists. The words attributed to him descend through oral family lore, passed principally through Rose's sister Agnes and recorded decades afterward by biographer Lawrence Leamer. In that version, Honey Fitz reminded his daughter that she had chosen her bed and would lie in it, and that a Catholic woman does not divorce. He sent her back. The man who had opposed the marriage for 8 years, who had moved her across continents to keep her from Joseph Kennedy, looked at his exhausted daughter in his doorway and sent her back to the man he had never wanted her to marry. 3 miles between the life Rose lived and the life she might have built. 3 miles, and her father's door closed in her face. Nobody disputes the outcome. Rose returned to Brookline within weeks. The marriage continued for another 49 years, and across the 12 years that followed her return, she bore 5 more children: Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward. 9 in all. Whatever protests she had carried into Dorchester in 1920, she left it behind in her mother's front room like a coat she was never permitted to collect. Something closed in her that winter, permanently. The woman who walked back through the door at Beales Street bore only a partial resemblance to the girl who once poured tea for ward captains. She stopped asking. In place of asking, she constructed a life that required nothing whatever from her husband: a schedule, a faith, a set of rituals, and eventually a filing system. By 1927, Joseph Kennedy controlled a film studio and a fortune built on stocks, and Hollywood interested him more with every passing month. He met Gloria Swanson that year. Swanson ranked among the biggest stars in American film, a woman of 28 whose face sold more magazines than any politician alive. Within months, Joseph controlled her finances, produced her pictures, and shared her bed. Both wore wedding rings. Neither pretended otherwise in private. In November of 1928, the 3 of them sailed for Europe aboard the Isle de France. Joseph arranged it. Rose accepted the arrangement and spent 6 days in the company of the woman whose name Boston whispered whenever her husband entered a room. She did it without a raised voice, without a trembling lip, and without a single word to anyone. Photographs from that period show the 2 women standing side by side, both of them smiling. Swanson later wrote that Rose treated her with unfailing warmth throughout the crossing. That warmth haunted Swanson for the rest of her life. In her memoir, published more than 50 years afterward, Swanson turned the problem over and never once solved it, landing finally on 3 possibilities and refusing to choose among them: a saint, a fool, or an actress finer than herself. Swanson never picked. Every biographer since has picked one of the 3, and the choice a writer settles on describes the writer rather than Rose Kennedy. Swanson departed the story around 1930. The pattern did not depart with her. Gossip in Hollywood and in the Capitol attached Joseph's name to secretaries and actresses across the following 30 years and to more than one woman employed inside his own houses. His sons absorbed the lesson so thoroughly that 2 of them carried the same habits into the White House. Rose never addressed any of it. Not to a priest. Not to a sister. Not to a friend. Not to a child. Her daughter Eunice, questioned about her father's affairs long afterward, answered that her mother never mentioned the subject and then repeated the word never 3 separate times, as though a single denial lacked the strength to carry so much weight. Rose Kennedy attended Mass every morning for roughly 80 years. In Brookline, in Bronxville, in Hyannisport, and in Palm Beach. She walked to church whatever the weather, sometimes covering several miles on foot before the household woke. The theology she practiced belonged to a church that no longer exists in that form. It demanded submission, rewarded suffering, forbade divorce absolutely, and promised an accounting in the next world for every humiliation swallowed quietly in this one. The Catholicism of Rose's generation drew a hard line around marriage and permitted nothing to cross it. Annulment existed in theory and almost never in practice for a woman of her station. Divorce meant excommunication from the only community that granted her an identity. A Catholic wife who abandoned her husband forfeited her children, her family, her standing in the parish, and any reasonable hope of heaven. Rose understood the terms. She accepted them at 24 and never revisited them across the following 70 years. The Church had given her a story in which suffering was not a wound but a currency. She spent it every morning at 7 o'clock, at whatever altar would have her. From the early 1920s onward, she traveled to Europe alone once a year for 6 to 8 weeks at a stretch. The children remained behind with governesses. Rose shopped in Paris, prayed in Rome, studied the couture houses, and sent back instructions. Barbara Perry, one of her biographers, advances a theory that the trips functioned as contraception the Church could not condemn, since a wife who spends 2 months abroad conceives no children. Other historians reject the reading. No letter from Rose supports it. At home, she ran the household through paper. A file of 3x5 index cards, 1 card for each child, recorded weights, illnesses, dental appointments, vaccination dates, and shoe sizes updated in her own hand across 3 decades. When a child required correction or instruction, Rose wrote the message on a slip of paper and pinned it to his clothing. She rarely raised her voice. She rarely used it at all if a note could carry the point. The children grew up understanding that their mother communicated by memorandum. Intimacy, in the Kennedy household, arrived in writing and was filed alphabetically. By the 1930s, the couple slept in separate bedrooms, an arrangement they carried from Bronxville down to Palm Beach and finally to Hyannisport, where each of them would eventually die. And John Kennedy, campaigning for the presidency, told the country he never once heard a cross word passed between his parents. He told the truth in a narrow sense. Crosswords require conversation. Rosemary Kennedy turned 23 in 1941. She read at a 4th grade level and wrote long, affectionate letters in an unsteady hand. By that year, she suffered violent mood swings and episodes of rage that terrified a family built entirely on the appearance of control. At night, she slipped out of her convent school. Joseph Kennedy, then 53, feared scandal above almost everything, and a daughter wandering the capital after dark threatened the political futures he had already mapped for his sons. He consulted physicians. 2 of them, Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts, promoted a procedure that severed connections in the frontal lobe of the brain. A lobotomy. In November of 1941, they performed it on Rosemary at George Washington University Hospital. Watts described the operation years afterward to the writer Ronald Kessler. They entered through the top of the skull. The patient remained awake under a mild tranquilizer, reciting on command while the surgeon cut. The doctor stopped only when her responses stopped. Think about that for a moment. A 23-year-old woman, conscious, speaking aloud, until the words simply ceased coming and the surgeon knew he had gone far enough. The medical press of the period treated Freeman and Watts as pioneers. A later generation would call them what they were. Rose's knowledge of the operation divides her biographers more sharply than any other question about her life. For decades, the family maintained that Joseph acted alone, and Rose herself insisted she learned nothing until it was over. Kate Clifford Larson, working from the medical correspondence, reached a different conclusion. Rose sat through the psychiatric consultations. She read the assessments. She understood in all likelihood that surgeons planned to open her daughter's skull, whatever she chose to remember afterward. The operation destroyed Rosemary completely. She emerged unable to speak more than a few words, unable to walk without assistance, incontinent, and permanently dependent on strangers who would keep her for the rest of her life. The family placed her at Craig House in Beacon, New York, from 1941 until 1949, then moved her to St. Coletta in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she would live for another 56 years. Joseph Kennedy never visited his daughter after the operation. Rose kept away for more than 20 years. The subject never surfaced in family conversation or correspondence for decades afterward. The household practiced silence the way other families practice religion. It cost nothing and it protected everyone except the person it erased. On the 12th of August 1944, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. climbed into a bomber packed with 20,000 pounds of explosive and lifted off from an airfield in Suffolk. The plan: bail out over the English coast while the bomber flew on by radio control toward a German rocket site. The plan never reached its second stage. The bomber detonated in midair before he reached the jump point. Nothing of him came back. He died at 29, and his father had spent every one of those years building him toward the presidency. Joseph Kennedy Sr. collapsed. He shut himself in his bedroom at Hyannisport and lay there in the dark for days, refusing food, refusing light, refusing the world. The man who bent markets and studios to his will had found the one thing money could not reach. Rose behaved differently. She attended Mass as usual, walked on the beach, greeted the neighbors, and then gathered the family and delivered an instruction that would govern the Kennedys for the next quarter century. No tears in this house. The rule originated in 1944, not in 1963, not in 1968, though the popular version assigns it to the assassinations. Rose issued it over her firstborn son. Grief, she reasoned, indulged the self at the expense of the living, and a family with public duties could not afford the spectacle of a mother in pieces. She lost her eldest son in 1944, her second daughter in 1948, her second son in 1963, her third son in 1968, and she appeared in public after each of those deaths with dry eyes and a composed face. The country read her composure as strength. Some of it deserved that name. 40 years of enforced practice supplied the rest. What the country called dignity, Rose had built out of necessity, one suppressed year at a time, until the suppression itself became indistinguishable from the person. Kathleen Kennedy, called Kick by everyone who loved her, fell for an English aristocrat during the war. William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire, belonged to one of the most prominent Protestant houses in Britain with a lineage of anti-Catholic politics stretching back generations. Rose opposed the marriage with everything she owned. She threatened disownment, enlisted priests, wrote letters, and finally refused to attend the wedding on the 6th of May 1944. Cavendish died in Belgium 4 months afterward, shot by a German sniper. Cake, widowed at 24, remained in England. Rose regarded the death as an answer from heaven, and her daughter understood exactly how her mother read it. 4 years later, Kick fell in love again. Peter Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, a Protestant and a married man whose own divorce proceedings dragged on in the background. Beyond every line her mother had ever drawn, Rose threatened to cut her off from the family money and to erase her from the family entirely. Joseph characteristically negotiated. He agreed to meet the couple in Paris in May of 1948. The plane carrying Kick and Fitzwilliam toward that meeting flew into a storm over the Rhone Valley on the 13th of May and crashed into a mountainside. Kick died at 28. Rose's reaction survives in the accounts of those who watched it. She read the crash as a divine verdict upon a daughter who had defied her church. Then she checked into the New England Baptist Hospital in Boston for medical tests while her daughter's body was prepared for burial in England. She did not cross the ocean. She did not stand at the graveside. She did not come. Joseph Kennedy stood at that grave alone in a Derbyshire churchyard, the only Kennedy who made the journey, watching his daughter lowered into earth that had loved her more than her own mother could manage. On the 19th of December 1961, Joseph Kennedy played 18 holes of golf in Palm Beach and complained of dizziness on the drive home. Before the afternoon ended, a massive stroke dropped him. He survived. The damage paralyzed his right side and wrecked the speech centers of his brain so that the man who commanded studios, banks, ambassadors, and a president could produce exactly one word for the remaining 8 years of his life. The word was no. Rose turned 71 that summer. Across those 8 years, she supplied almost none of his daily care. Anne Gargan, his niece, moved into the house and took charge of him day to day. Professional nurses handled the rest. Nurse Rita Dallas later published an account of the household and found within it a distance between husband and wife she never fully explained to her readers. Dallas recorded the schedule with precision. Rose attended Mass at 7, played golf in the morning, took her meals apart, and visited her husband at fixed hours for a fixed number of minutes. She spoke to him about the weather and the grandchildren, and then she withdrew. The wheelchair that carried one of the richest men in America sat wherever the nurses left it, and Rose arranged her days so that she never needed to look at it for long. Twice during those 8 years the house filled with reporters. In November of 1963, a bullet killed the second son in Dallas. In June of 1968, another killed the third son in a Los Angeles hotel pantry. Both times, the family wheeled Joseph Kennedy in front of a television set so that a man who could not speak could watch the funerals of the sons he had built. Rose attended the Requiem Mass for both. She wore black, took communion, and returned to her schedule the following morning. Joseph Kennedy died on the 18th of November 1969 at the age of 81. He never again spoke a full sentence after December 1961. The man who arranged his daughter's lobotomy, conducted his affairs in front of his wife, and directed the lives of 9 children from behind a telephone spent his last 8 years dependent on women he could no longer command. And the woman he humiliated for half a century prayed for him every morning without once sitting long at his side. In 1974, at 84, Rose Kennedy published a memoir titled Times to Remember. The book sold well. It described a happy marriage, an attentive husband, a devoted father, and a family blessed by God and then tested by him. Gloria Swanson went unmentioned. Every other woman went unmentioned. The operation performed on Rosemary was presented not as a surgical catastrophe but as a natural affliction the family had managed with grace and love. And the marriage, 55 years of silence, separate bedrooms, and a grief that was never permitted a name, was compressed into a single sentence. Rose wrote, "He left me in peace to manage my children and my household." Read one way, that sentence pays a compliment. Turn it over slowly, and something else appears entirely. It is the record of a transaction. A woman surrendered her marriage in exchange for a jurisdiction. She absorbed the affairs, buried the children, and in return was granted sovereignty over the nursery and the filing cabinet and nothing else. 27 words. 55 years. That is the arithmetic of what Rose Kennedy called a life. The public account of Rosemary required its own maintenance. Ronald Kessler, investigating the family decades afterward, quoted a former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, who explained that describing Rosemary as mentally retarded rather than mentally ill protected John Kennedy's political prospects, since voters of that era treated hereditary insanity as disqualifying. The distinction rescued a presidency. It cost a woman 6 decades inside institutions. Nobody in the family corrected the record while Rose Kennedy lived. In 2006, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library opened 300 boxes of Rose Kennedy's private papers. 11 years had passed between her death and the unsealing of those boxes. Historians expected the serene woman of the memoir. What the letters and diaries delivered instead stopped them cold. A mother frantic about her children's health. A wife marooned for weeks in empty houses. A Catholic woman recording spells of depression in language so careful and contained it made the depression itself harder to read. And a woman who mentioned none of it, not to a priest, not to a friend, not to a daughter, not to a printing press. The private record contradicts the published one on nearly every page. She had been writing to herself all along, in a voice she trusted to no one living, sealed in boxes nobody could open until she had been dead for more than a decade. The family eventually turned the wound into a cause. Eunice, the daughter who insisted her mother never spoke of anything, founded the Special Olympics in 1968 and pushed the country toward a more humane understanding of people like her sister. Rose lived long enough to watch that movement spread across the world. She never publicly connected it to the operation, and she never wrote a single page explaining why the Kennedy who most needed protection received the least of it. Her biographers divide over what to call her. Doris Kearns Goodwin portrays a woman who chose not to see, retreating into ritual and schedule to preserve what remained of her sanity. Barbara Perry rejects the pure victim, arguing that Rose built the Kennedy mystique with her own hands and treated the production of extraordinary children as her life's compensation. David Nassau describes a cold patriarchy in which Joseph ran everything while his wife withdrew into faith and travel. Lawrence Leamer, the biographer who named the marriage a silent hell, credits her discipline and her faith while insisting she paid a terrible price for both. None of them are entirely wrong. None of them are entirely right. Rose resists every category they build for her, and that resistance, that final refusal to be fully legible to anyone, may be the one act of defiance she permitted herself across 104 years. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy died on the 22nd of January 1995 at Hyannisport. She reached 104, 55 of those years married to Joseph, 26 of them widowed. She outlived 4 of her 9 children, while a 5th lived on in a Wisconsin institution, the daughter she had not visited for 20 years, the daughter who had once recited words aloud in a surgical theater until the words stopped coming and the surgeon set down his instrument. The public called her the matriarch. Journalists wrote of her faith, her endurance, her composure under a weight of grief that would have destroyed most people. They built a mythology around her silence and called it strength. She left behind 300 boxes, and inside them, written in her own hand and sealed for a generation, was the full record of everything she had survived and everything it had cost: the fear, the loneliness, the depression, the affairs she watched her husband conduct in front of her, the daughter she could not bring herself to visit, the tears she had forbidden everyone around her to shed. She had stored them somewhere all those years. It turns out she had stored them in the dark, in her own handwriting, waiting for a world that might finally be willing to read them honestly. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Rose Kennedy. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments. I hope you subscribed and turned on notifications to receive all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that concludes things from me, so I will see all of you in the next video. Thanks.